Well, we're gathering today. It's the day after the big event, the one that all the candles and wreaths and readings and shopping and cooking and wrapping and preparing had been leading to. But the early church, in their wisdom, acknowledged that the celebration of Christmas, the staggering truth of the incarnation of Jesus, how God became flesh and walked among us, was too big to just absorb on one single day. Hence, they celebrated it for 12 days. And so we can conclude that reflecting and celebrating Christmas is not yet out of place. So let us linger here a moment more with all that has come before us, with the truths we unwrapped during Advent, with the message proclaimed on Christmas Eve, with the story that we long to tell over and over again. Let's spend just a little more time with the people gathered at this familiar scene. Mary and Joseph and the shepherds who heard good news from the angels, even the Magi from the east and a star shining bright over the entire scene. Our nativity sets are often not complete without a few animals too, a donkey, a cow, some sheep, maybe even a camel or two. They're all gathered around one central figure who is at this moment in the story merely an infant, but we know that this crude cradle houses the hope for the entire world. And so we press in closer and we remain just a moment here. As we linger with the manger scene, however, I'd like us to consider these words. They were written by an Anglican priest in Ontario. He writes this: "Don't keep Christ in Christmas. Let him out. Let him out of the box decorations stored in the attic. Let him out of the carols as background to your shopping. Let him out of a sentimental story cleansed of violence and pain. Let him out of the creche where he remains a helpless infant, and where the only woman present is silent and meek, and where poverty is romanticized with no threat and no smell. And the shepherds are cuddly, and everyone is white, and there is no messiness to obscure the miracle. Let him out of December's candlelit coziness, where his heat melts the wintry ice of our selfishness, and his buds unfold amidst the mud of injustice, and his flowers overtake the borders of manicured gardens, and his harvest fills barns with fruits we never knew existed. Don't keep Christ in Christmas, let him out. And then when Christmas comes round again, we won't have to keep him in it. For how could he not be in Christmas when he has been here the whole time, keeping us?" Let Christ out of Christmas is what Reverend Daniel Brayton urges us. And to do just that, I thought we might follow the example of someone who doesn't make it into our manger scenes, but who is integral to the story all the same. If you take a peek at the biblical stories that we tell at Christmas time, about how God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son, about how the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood, you might notice that one important person who factors into the story is not on display. And while we cannot actually place him at the manger, which is probably why he gets left out, he was indeed, according to the Gospel of Luke, the very first person to ever acknowledge Jesus before he was even born. When Mary, Jesus' mother, greets Elizabeth, the babe within Elizabeth's womb leaped for joy. And that baby, when he made his way into the world, was John the Baptist. In fact, in all four Gospels, John comes before Jesus to point the way to Jesus. So John is deeply connected to the story of Jesus coming into the world. And so even while lingering at the side of the manger, John's appearance at the beginning of the story invites us to make the circle of the manger a little bit wider. Now, just a note for convenience sake, we're in the Gospel of John, and we're talking about John the Baptist. So I'm going to distinguish them from each other by referring to the Gospel as the fourth Gospel. So that's what I mean when I say the fourth Gospel. So John the Baptist plays such a fascinating role in this story because he was actually a leader in his own right. And reading biblical stories about John, the evidence mounts that he was quite well known. He was someone who was able to draw others, to attract disciples and even draw a crowd. Consider the fuss that is being made over him by the movers and shakers in Jerusalem. The story that we read in the fourth gospel this morning began with these people sent from Jerusalem, which is the center, of course, of religious power. But they were sent out to where John was because everyone knew that something significant was happening there in Bethany on the other side of the Jordan River. But Bethany on the other side of the Jordan is nowhere really. In fact, modern scholars aren't even quite sure where exactly this place was. It certainly wasn't Jerusalem, with its bustling temple, the center of power, and where important people in religious circles resided. But even out there in the middle of nowhere, John is making waves. And our reading today begins in the middle of an interrogation with the priests and the scribes who've been sent to get an answer out of John to their most pressing question, just who do you think you are? Both in verse 21 and 22, they repeat this question or some version of it. And then they name some figures that were floating around in the collective imagination. First, they ask if perhaps he might be the Messiah. This Messiah was a royal figure from the line of David, and people expected the Messiah to arrive at some point or another, hopefully sooner rather than later. But John answers no. Not only no, but emphatically no. I am not the Messiah, John says, repeated for emphasis. Well, how about Elijah then, they ask. And if you read the description of John in other Gospels, you'll see that he bears more than a passing resemblance to that fiery prophet Elijah from the Old Testament, because John the Baptist is described as wearing clothing made of camel skin and eating a diet of locusts and honey, just like the prophet of old. But John the Baptist dispels that theory too. No, I'm not Elijah either. How about the prophet then, they ask once more, and he still says no. One thing you can say about John the Baptist is he knows who he is not. He answers these questions lobbed at him, knowing where he stands, which is actually quite refreshing, because John's job was not to become famous for the sake of having fame or so that his name would become well known. No, any fame or glory or power or influence or platform that John had, John used it to point to Jesus. John's I am not also stands in stark contrast to other points of the fourth gospel. And there are quite a few of them, actually, as you'll see when we go into it, where Jesus says, I am. John's own words demonstrate that he knows he's not the most important figure in the story. He's making a lot of noise, to be sure, but all of that is just a warm-up act. All of that is to ensure that people are gathered and made ready for the real deal, for the one who is, at least in our imagination right now, a baby lying in a manger. And John is doing the same thing that all those other figures actually in the manger scene are doing. Mary and Joseph and the shepherds and the angels and the magi, and even those animals that we have in our minds. John is pointing not to himself, but to Jesus. John knows who he is not. He is not the most important one, or the one whom all the fuss is about, or the one who will save the world. But saying that John the Baptist knows who he is not the same as saying that he's not worth anything, or that he's nothing, or that he's unimportant. Because the thing about John is he knew who he was as well. There's a beautiful song that we actually had it sung for us Christmas Eve, O Holy Night, and one of the lines is, long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. I think I would venture to say that John knew the worth of his own soul. He knew his own job, and his worth was to show other people Jesus. And when all the other people gathered here at the manger, making a fuss over the baby and scatter and go about their daily lives, it is John's job, at least for a time, to do what they did at Jesus' birth and point to Jesus. And truth be told, I don't think that John would mind so much that he isn't honored with a little figure clustered around the manger, because it was never in his nature to seek that kind of glory, and it was never in his job description to get recognition for himself. In fact, in one of John's last speaking roles in the fourth gospel, the story goes that John's disciples were getting a little bit worked up because Jesus was out with Jesus' disciples, and Jesus was baptizing people too. At that time, John was still carrying on his ministry, baptizing folks who came to him, and there were apparently still many who did, because we read in John chapter 3 that people were constantly coming to John to be baptized. But apparently aggrieved that people were now also going to be baptized by Jesus, some of John's disciples come to him to report it. And they say, "Rabbi, that man who was with you on the other side of the Jordan, the one you testified about, well, he is baptizing, and everyone is going to him." And John responds to them, and he begins his response with these words: "A person can only receive what is given to them from heaven." And then he ends his response with the humblest words ever: "He must become greater, I must become less." Jesus must become greater, I must become less. The words of a true disciple who follows Jesus. I said John was a leader in his own right, and he was, but he was a leader because he followed Jesus. And in taking the path that he did, he allowed others to follow him to Jesus. And that's the case all throughout the story. For we do catch a glimpse of John a few more times before the gospel is out. And in each and every case, he is always pointing to Jesus and always telling others about Jesus. The final word on John the Baptist in the fourth gospel brings us back to the spot that we read about this morning, to Bethany on the other side of the Jordan. It calls it to the place where John had been baptizing in the early days. And Jesus came to that spot because he was fleeing from a crowd who was trying to throw stones at him because of the things Jesus had been teaching about himself. They believed those words were blasphemy. So the people Jesus is fleeing from in that story do not understand who he is. Here's what we read. Then Jesus went back across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing in the early days. And there he stayed, and many people came to him. And they said, though John never performed a sign, all that John said about this man, meaning Jesus, was true. And in that place, many believed in Jesus. John never performed a miracle or a sign, but the crowd in that place, Bethany on the other side of the Jordan, was primed to receive Jesus because everything John said about Jesus was true. And all that is in contrast to the angry mob who thought that everything Jesus was saying about himself was something that was a lie that would warrant his death. But John did his job, and he did it well, because people in this little out-of-the-way place, some have even called it Hicksville, this Bethany beyond the Jordan, where we find John at the opening of the fourth gospel, those people are receptive to Jesus, and many there believed in him, because John holds the spotlight not on himself, but on Jesus. And this is, as it turns out, an excellent description of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. Now, there's a lovely poem. It's written by Howard Thurman, who was a pastor and a theologian, called The Work of Christmas. It goes like this. When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flock, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among people, to make music in the heart. The work of Christmas is to hold out the light of Jesus so that the lost and the broken and the hungry and the prisoner can see that there is a light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. To hold the light is to take the good news of Jesus into the world, and that is what John did. He held the light for others, like a person who holds a flashlight to point out the path. Or if you like a different analogy, the moon. The moon has no light of its own. It just reflects the light of the sun so that when it is night, we have a measure of light by which to walk. John knows who he is. He's the one who holds the light for other people, the one who reflected the light of God's Son, and he knows who he is not. As we have lingered at the scene of the manger, we have focused our attention on one character who's not actually present in most of our creches, but who does the work of Christmas all the same. And now the work of Christmas begins in our world, in these days when the work of Christmas is so sorely needed, and we can follow the example of John the Baptist. We know our role and our worth and our place. We know who we are not, and we know who we are. We are those who point to Jesus so that others may know and believe and may live. And we use whatever it is that we have been given from heaven, whether it's our jobs, our influence, our friendships, our platform, our hobbies, our gifts, whatever we have, not to bring glory to ourselves, but to point to Jesus. Because when we follow Jesus, we leave a path for others by which they may come and adore him. Because it is now, as the angels and the stars fade and the shepherds and kings return home, that the work of Christmas really begins. We see the work of Christmas demonstrated for us in one man who deserves recognition in our Christmas scenes and receives none, though because he was responsible to hold the light and point the way, he illuminated Jesus all the same. And I think he would be quite happy with that. Would you bow with me in a word of prayer? Glorious God, as we come before you today with the work of Christmas before us, we acknowledge that we are not the Messiah, that we are not responsible for saving the world. That job belongs ever and only to you. We thank you that you so love the world that you sent your one and only Son. And as we follow Jesus, we ask that you would give us the grace to hold the light so that others may see him. Amen. As you go now, may the worship that we have shared this Christmas lead to acts of service which transform people's lives. May the carols we have sung this Christmas help others to sing even in their sadness. May the gifts we've exchanged this Christmas deepen our spirit of giving throughout the year. May the candles we have lit this Christmas remind us that God intends no one to live in darkness. May the new people we have met this Christmas remind us that you, God, meet us in our neighbors. May the way that we have missed extended gathering this year, or the way that we have gathered with family and friends, make us appreciate anew the gift of loved ones. May the stories we've told again this Christmas be good news of great joy to all people on our lips and in our lives. And may the way that God has come close to us this Christmas not be forgotten, but remain hidden in our memories and be a rich resource to lift us when times are painful, to humble us when things are going well. For God is our life, our light, and our salvation this season and always. Amen. Go in peace.